Welcome back, my friends. On video number 2, we've seen the movements of grand pawns. But there's a special move we can do with our grand pawns in some special conditions, that is, taking en-passant an opponent's grand pawn. What is this? Well, you will see. Basically, it's the same as in chess.
Just take a look at this. Imagine I'm the white and I have one of my grand pawns on rank plane 5. Then imagine a black grand pawn moves from its starting position on rank plane 7 into the same rank plane 5 where my grand pawn is, on a box next to it on the same row or column. Doing so, it passes the box where I could have caught it. So, on next move, and only on next move, I can capture it. I take it away from the framework and put my white grand pawn on the box it would have occupied if it moved one step only, because grand pawns always move or capture in advancement. I cannot capture sideways. In this example, my white grand pawn is in eta b5. A black grand pawn from its original box in theta b7 moves 2 steps into theta b5, reaching a box next to my grand pawn on the same column b5. So on next move I can capture it. I take it off the GrandChess framework and put my white grand pawn in theta b6. But I cannot take this other black grand pawn here in eta a5 because it was moved before. Last move was grand pawn into theta b5. I can only capture a grand pawn on the move immediately following its own move. In this other example, a black grand pawn is in delta g4. I can move my pawn 2 steps from its initial box delta h2 into delta h4. Well, on the very next move, my opponent, the black, can take it, putting this black grand pawn in delta h3. The same if I move delta f2 into delta f4. The opponent can take moving the grand pawn into delta f3. Or if I move grand pawn gamma g2 into gamma g4, black can take and move into gamma g3. Finally, if I move this grand pawn epsilon g2 into epsilon g4, it can also be taken en-passant with black grand pawn in epsilon g3. Obviously, any of these moves can be done by my opponent on the very next move if the player deems it appropriate. Otherwise, black can do other moves, but will not be able to perform the same en-passant capture further on. It's now or never. Another very interesting feature regarding the grand pawns is that they can achieve promotion. This is what gives the grand pawns much of their strength. You know this rule from chess. When a grand pawn reaches the last rank plane on the opposite wing, it is immediately changed into another type of grand piece. It can become, or better, it must become, a grand queen, or a grand rook, or a grand bishop, or a grand knight. Not another grand pawn, or another grand king. The player chooses what grand piece it becomes, usually a grand queen. No matter how many grand pieces of the same type you have on the GrandChess framework, you can add another anyway by promotion of a grand pawn. Look at this. A white grand pawn in beta f7, white to move. I can advance it into beta f8 and immediately replace it in that box with a grand queen. By doing this, a new grand queen suddenly appears, and at the same time my grand rook in alpha f7 is checking the black grand king in theta f7. This can prove very useful for my attack. Black, for instance, cannot take the new grand queen with the grand rook in alpha f8 because defending the grand king is paramount when it's under check. Anyway, in this position, I could also promote the grand pawn with a capture. I can take the black grand rook in alpha f8, moving my grand pawn there, also in this case checking the grand king. So the new grand queen cannot be taken by the black grand queen in alpha a8, because the black grand king is checked. This other example has a black grand pawn in beta h2. Black can move it to gamma h1, capturing the white grand rook and instantly promoting the grand pawn to another grand piece. Of course, it can become a grand queen and the game is going to be won. But in this specific position, if the grand pawn becomes a grand knight, then the game is over right now. Let's see here how. The new grand knight is defended by a light-squared grand bishop in epsilon d1, so the grand king cannot capture it. Boxes beta h2 and beta h1, where the grand king is, are under check by the black grand rook in beta h7. This check has been uncovered by the promoting grand pawn. Alpha h1 is checked by the grand bishop in theta h8. Gamma h2 is occupied by a white grand pawn and beta g1 by a white grand rook, so they cannot be accessed by the grand king. Gamma g1 is checked by the black grand pawn in delta g2. Beta g2 is checked by the grand pawn in alpha g3. Finally, the boxes alpha g1 and alpha h2 are under check by whom? By the newly promoted grand knight. So the promotion has uncovered a direct check on the opponent's grand king from the grand rook. The checking grand piece cannot be taken, nor the check can be shielded. All the boxes where the grand king could eventually move are either occupied by a piece of its same color or under check. So this is a case of grand checkmate. Promotion to a grand knight in this case is instantly winning. The only surprise in GrandChess compared to chess is the pre-castling. This is really new. Yes, we need to move twice to perform the castling maneuver. First a pre-castling, then a regular castling. This is the only one substantial innovation in our rules compared to the traditional game. On the starting position, a grand king is in the center of its rank plane. We need one move to take it to the side, then another move to take it near a corner. Pre-castling can only be performed once by each player during the game. This is an exceptional move for three different reasons. 1. It involves the movement of two grand pieces, the grand king and the grand rook, instead of just one. 2. The grand king moves 3 or 4 boxes instead of just one. 3. The grand rook moves to a box beyond the one occupied by the grand king. This is not allowed in other moves. So, in pre-castling, the grand king and one of the grand rooks are involved. But which grand rooks? Well, one of these 4 you see on the sides on starting position. They are placed for white in epsilon h1, theta e1, epsilon a1, alpha e1, for black in epsilon h8, theta e8, epsilon a8, alpha e8. In order to perform a pre-castling, 3 conditions should be met. I think you know something similar. 1. Both the grand king and the grand rook involved must never have been moved before during the game. 2. The boxes interposed between the grand king and the grand rook must be free of friendly or opposing grand pieces. 3. No boxes, including those in which the grand king and the grand rook are located, and all the intermediate boxes should be subject to a threat of capture by an opponent's grand piece. That is to say, they must not be under check. These boxes may be 4 or 5. If the three conditions are fulfilled, you may carry out precastling by taking the Grandking to the box on the edge of the framework where the Grand Rook stood, and moving the Grand Rook to the adjacent box in the direction where the Grandking previously stood. So, precastling can occur in 4 different forms, depending on which Grand Rook is involved. It can be lateral king's side, lateral queen's side, upper vertical, and lower vertical. Sometimes you may choose which side you want to precastle. Like precastling, castling 2 can only be performed once by each player during the game. This is also an exceptional move for 3 different reasons. 1. It involves the movement of 2 grand pieces, the Grandking and the Grand Rook, instead of just 1. 2. The Grandking moves 2 boxes instead of just 1. 3. The Grand Rook moves to a box beyond the one occupied by the Grandking, and this is not allowed in other moves. So, castling involves the Grandking and one of the 4 Grand Rooks staying in the corners. This castling is very much the same as in chess. 3 conditions must be met in order to be able to carry it out. 1. The Grandking must have been moved beforehand only to carry out the precastling, and the Grand Rook must never have been moved during the game. 2. The boxes interposed between the Grandking and the Grand Rook must be free of friendly or opposing grand pieces. 3. None of the 3 boxes that the Grandking leaves, crosses, and occupies must be subject to a threat of capture by an opposing grand piece. That is to say, they must not be under check. If the 3 conditions are met, the player may perform castling by moving the Grandking 2 steps towards the Grand Rook and the Grand Rook beyond the Grandking into the box between the one the Grandking occupied before and the one it occupies after castling. Castling can come in 2 different forms, depending on the distance between the Grandking and the Grand Rook. It can be long or short. It is said long when the Grand Rook moves 3 boxes, short when it moves 2 boxes.
My friends, are you tired of explanations? Okay, then let's take a look at the final video where we're going to see one complex real play position and how to win by a grand checkmate, plus some useful suggestions for your strategy.